Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu, avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am so happy to be joined by longtime friend, mentor, professionally accomplished, internationally renowned Dominican theologian, Father Michael Sherwin.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be back at Ave.
Yeah, so glad to have you here. And you're here for a conference that we organized on the 800th anniversary of Aquinas' birth in 1225, now 2025, and how Aquinas responds to the crises of our age. What would Aquinas do?
What would Aquinas do? We can all get wristbands. That
exactly.
WWAD, yes.
I love that. And Father Sherwin, for those who may not know, did his fundamental theology studies and formation within the Dominican House of Studies in Berkeley. California is a member of the West Coast Dominicans, did his PhD at Notre Dame, and then taught back at the Dominican House, or the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, in the Dominican House of Studies there, and then at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland for almost 20 years, and now at the Angelicum, where he directs the Institute for Spirituality. So anyway, it's just been great to have you here, and I was so blessed to be able to study with you when I was in my first days as a recent convert and kind of convert to the study of theology from my undergraduate degree in engineering. And you were a great mentor and a friend and a spiritual father when I was a student, and our family, with my wife and my child as well, at Notre Dame back in the 90s.
You're one of the veterans of the old student housing.
Yes,
married student housing, yes.
You know, we're thinking about this. So how would Aquinas respond to the crises of our age? And in many ways, I think you could say that the predominant crisis of our age is a crisis of belief, right? There's a line that reminds me from, I think it's one of Chronicles of Narnia's in C.S. Lewis, and in the Silver Chair, anyway, there's a character who asks another character, they're two school children that are at a nasty school, the experiment house, where the children are being experimented upon sort of by these novel and progressive ideologies. But anyway, the one asks the other one, are you good at believing things? You know, are you good at believing things? And it seems that our age is an age that is not good at believing things. And so by not believing or not really trusting the belief in the faith as it's been handed on, of course, the irony is we end up believing in a lot of nonsense from time to time. But I wanted to kind of just focus on this question, right? What does it mean to believe in Jesus Christ? You know, is Jesus Christ real? Can we know him? And right, what does it mean to believe in him? And how can Aquinas help us?
Well, there's several questions I hear you asking. In terms of how he would respond to this situation, I think it's helpful to remember that although it was a dynamic and exciting time that Aquinas was living in, it was not a peaceful time. And his family were the local nobility in that kind of causeway between the city of Naples and the Papal States. It's a beautiful area, but it's also a stretch of ground that's been fought over for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the Aquino family castle was right at kind of near the border between the Papal States and the states that were under the emperor and what became the twin kingdom of Sicily and Naples. And so the family's situation was profoundly shaped by this conflict, and for good and for ill. So, for example, they sent him to study at Monte Cassino, the big Benedictine monastery, shortly after it was had been sacked and in terrible situations. So it was a kind of war-torn educational experience that he starts as a very young boy, oblate. And then through the conflicts with the emperor, the emperor expels all the non-Neapolitan monks from the monastery. So the abbot has to tell the Aquinos, well, we can no longer educate him, so you need to send him to Naples. So Aquinas was he was not a romantic when it came to the chaos and the challenges of human life. So I've been deeply influenced by the way in which Alistair MacIntyre attempts to see how Aquinas approached the different heritages in conflict. So when he goes to Naples, he's, the Neapolitan language is his mother tongue. He has an older brother who is was famous at the time, a servant to the Emperor Frederick II, who was called the marvel of the age. He spoke Arabic, he spoke Latin, and he wanted to do for Latin culture what the Arabs had done for Arabic culture, which is translate Greek wisdom into Arabic. Well, he wanted to translate it into Latin. And so he founds the University of Naples for the teaching of the wisdom of the Greeks. And Aquinas is absolutely mesmerized. But he's not, this is the amazing thing about the gift of faith that he had. He's not a uncritical interpreter of the heritage. He's fascinated by what the human mind, through disciplined philosophical investigation, can learn and discover. But he also sees the limits. And he's formed in what would, I think, many scholars describe, I think perhaps unjustly, but would describe as the Augustinian tradition, which he loves as well. And he's been formed also in the desert tradition. They read the conferences of John Cassian at Monte Cassino, and then when he becomes a Dominican, they read it every day. So his incredibly gifted mind is studying two clashing cultures. And what he's able to do is, using the principles of each of these two clashing cultures, is to show how the other tradition, translate it into the language of, for example, the insights of Augustine, translating them into Aristotelian terms. He's able to show how the Catholic tradition is able to answer better the Aristotelian tradition's own questions. And then he's able to show how, with the aid of an expert on humanity like Aristotle, he can help Augustine better answer the very questions he was pursuing. So I think that's the way he would approach our contemporary culture. He would find many things in the challenge of belief that he would find familiar, and the problem of evil and the problem of innocent suffering. And it's, if you look, for example, the cultural atheism of Britain, it's been a long time brewing because of the disasters. You can go already back to the Boer Wars, where they had a huge wake-up call, and how people even forget about how many of the elite of the British officer class and the rural gentry were killed, quite surprisingly, by the scrappy, well-armed Boers who didn't fight like the Redcoats. And then First World War, then the Second World War, so that you have a spiritually traumatized people who belief in God has become a problem. And I think Aquinas would have great sympathy for that. And he would then try to understand the world in which they have been formed, and show how the gospel better answers the very questions that they themselves are posing. Aquinas' own understanding of faith, to get to that part of your question, is deeply rooted in all that the scriptures have to say. And this is the big challenge of what Robert Southern and a lot of the scholars, and we benefit from all the hard work that was done in terms of medieval scholarship, and all of the new critical editions of text, all of that allow us to see things that earlier generations were not able to see. And what's known now as the 12th century Renaissance, they start, because of the peace of the Normans, they start being able to do more than simply memorize biblical texts. And they start using the tools of Aristotelian logic to ask questions of these texts. And, someone like Abelard could make mischief with that, with his book Sic et Non, to show that the fathers disagree. And he wasn't simply trying to be destructive, but he was pointing out a real issue. But that's the thing. When in places like, first, the walled city of, I think in English we say Laon, in French, the walled city, which is about 80 miles to the northeast of Paris, they start the scholastic method there with a fellow by the name of Anselm of Laon. And they start asking questions they don't know how to answer. And some of these problems last 100 years. But it's in asking the questions that they try from within the scriptures and the fathers to find answers to them. And just one example, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord.
The fear of the Lord.
But love is not yet perfect in one who is afraid. So how do you reconcile those two things? And so you start developing the notion of filial fear and servile fear, and to show how one points to one and the other points to it, so that you try to understand what the message is. And of course, the faith underlying that is that the primary author of the scriptures, Old and New Testament, is the Holy Spirit. And he is saying something coherent. And we are called to discern that. So what does Scripture say about faith? Those who would come to God, this is Hebrews 11, famous of chapter, those who will come to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Well, that's very beautiful. It's not the fullness of faith, but it is the beginning of the journey. And I think one of the things that have had a huge influence on me is the way in which Aquinas says that if you would grow on the way, and they were very good at showing how the Old Testament morality is presented as a way. And the primary moral term in the Old Testament is tzedakah, which I think is right relationship with God, is probably the best way to translate it. We translated the Greeks translated it into dikaosune, the only Greek virtue that is relational by nature, and then
which would be justice or righteousness, right?
Yes. So when Jerome is confronted with how to translate this, he translates it as justitia, and then all of our Western the languages that flow from Latin translated either as righteousness or justice. The wonderful Anglican divines who do the King James Version are wary of the way in which Greek thought will use justice as a particular virtue. So they turn to the rich Germanic word and use the word righteousness. So Abraham believed, and it was accounted to him as dikaosune, which is translating tzedakah. And so the King James translates it as righteousness. And there's a certain amount of, I can understand the temptation to translate it as righteousness, but the problem is that the Germanic notion of righteousness will go in directions that perhaps we might not want it to go. But anyway, the way, to grow in the way, Aquinas says, you have to believe the way an apprentice trusts the master craftsman, and that God in Christ is the master craftsman of the way of justice. And that's very beautiful. Also, he has the idea that the youngsters, like children, trust their parents first before they grow in their own sense. That it was not necessary for everyone in the Old Testament to have an explicit faith in Christ as the way to salvation, but they had to trust those who had that fuller vision. So if it was enough to trust Abraham, it was enough to trust the patriarchs. But of course, the patriarchs, in numerous ways, the apostles and the New Testament writers, but even in the prophets of the Old Testament, will present them as seeing as Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And Abraham, Moses, Moses has a pattern of what all of the sacrifices are ordered to. And people like to say, well, the pattern is of the temple. Well, no, actually, the tent of meeting is a human model of something else. As Jesus says very clearly, tear down destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. He's not talking about the brick and mortar. He's talking about himself. And the letter to the Hebrews, but also all the fathers say that what Moses sees is the pattern of his Savior, the Word made incarnate. But all the other folks don't have to have that explicitly. So Aquinas has a developmental notion of faith, and so salvation is from the Jews because of the Incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Christ. But people come to that knowledge in different ways. So it's sufficient in Hebrews that you believe that God exists and that he rewards those who seek him. It's a very gentle, it's a very different notion that some is sometimes presented of faith. This developmental notion runs throughout Aquinas.
Yeah, and I remember Aquinas commenting on that passage in the Summa, and he also talks about the fact that rewarding those who seek them is really rooted in the idea that we have some sense that we need a savior, that we can't, and he'll talk about this when he comments on like idolatry and sacrifice and religion. He says somehow like sacrifice and religion are proper to humanity because humanity on its own can recognize that it isn't everything and it needs something higher, that there is something higher, there's a higher ordering principle, and that we need it because something's wrong. Yes. And so we have this idea that the implicit faith is not merely that God exists, but that he will reward those, which really means that he will rescue, he will redeem those who seek and ask. And so it is in those two things, one in God as the creator, providential creator, and also then in the Incarnation, that it's an intuition that somehow God will reward, rescue, redeem humanity, because implicit in there is an understanding that we can't rescue and redeem ourselves. Yeah. And so, maybe could you talk a little bit more about that maybe experience then in this gradual developmental way of somehow coming to recognize the insufficiency of our own efforts, and a way that so then when we kind of see Jesus and what Jesus does, we would embrace that with gratitude, and as opposed to perhaps how many people somehow see belief as threatening.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think also the other feature that we have not touched on is that there are very intelligent beings who do not want people to come to know the infinite love and mercy of the Father, and they are permitted in God's great providence to wreak havoc. And you can learn a lot by learning how countries that go to war pursue, how geniuses for war, how Machiavellian characters pursue war, and how they attempt to destroy their enemy. One of the first things you do is you destroy the reputation of the enemy, and you try to lead people to rebel against their leader. And so portraying God as his opposite is a very, and of course, how is our unseen enemy described? He's the father of lies. A perfect example of this is Lucifer. Well, what is Lucifer in the Latin tradition? It's the name. We were talking about this when we were talking about the stars. What is the Latin Lucifer? It's the morning star. And, of course, the morning star in Latin culture is also the evening star. It's Venus. Now, the morning star, the name for the morning star in Latin culture is Lucifer. And in Scripture, who is Lucifer? It's a symbol of either Christ or of Our Lady. But he has appropriated it to himself. So now when people think of Lucifer, even when there's now TV programs, it's been completely appropriated by someone who has stolen the title to himself. But he doesn't bring light. He only brings darkness. So
Prince of Darkness. Yeah.
The Prince of Darkness and Prince of Lies. So we have to be aware that the reputation of the Father of mercy, God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, not to condemn the world. And then if you look at the different versions of that, that the world might have life, that while we were still sinners, the Lord loved us, and the Son dies so that sin may be overcome, and we might enjoy life then in its fullness. Now, all of that is turned on its head in popular culture. The perfect example of this is our father in faith, Abraham. We make the other mistake of tending to kind of to tame or domesticate the sacrifice of Isaac. It should trouble us. It troubles everyone in every age. But if you read some of what the militant atheists, they portray God as, a wicked, who the God of Israel that would demand this, what a terrible beast he must be, and all these things. But what does it really reveal? Abraham on the way, Jesus in John's Gospel says, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. And if you look at the Hebrew, what does he call the mountain? Now, it's very difficult about the Hebrew, but if we look at the Greek, if we think that the rabbis at Alexandria knew what they were doing, it's on this mountain, the Lord will be seen. Well, what does that mean? And what is this all about? And the whole idea that when the first time a father is addressed as father, and the first time a son is addressed as son, and the first time the word love is used, the common word for love is used in the Old Testament, ahav, is in the context, take your son whom you love and sacrifice him in a place that I will show you. Those 3 days of the dark night for Abraham. But at some point, Abraham begins to see something else. And the symbolism he is embodying, and this is what Hebrews says, that they enacted in parable. That's the word he uses, the Greek word for parable. They enacted, Isaac and Abraham, in parable the events of the New Testament. And you have a father with a son carrying the wood on his back, and the father's carrying a torch. You've got Father, Son, and Spirit. And the sacrifice, what the Lord will provide. The Lord will see beforehand. The Lord will provide. So what it's being revealed to Abraham is that there is a father who does love his son and who will sacrifice that son for love of us. Isaac was not to be sacrificed. Isaac was to be the symbol of sacrifice. So then the New Testament, what's the first time love is used? The very same word in the Greek version. The first time love is used in the New Testament. Once again, it's God speaking, and it's speaking about his love for the newly baptized Jesus. And then in case we're slow on the uptake, the transfiguration. So instead of revealing God to be this wicked ogre that asks for us to sacrifice the things we hold most dear, it's revealing that that's what God does for us in order to save us from sin and death. So our contemporaries, obstacles to them seeing that are going to be put up all over the place. And all we can do is try to live fully in the Lord, the truth of the Father's mercy, active through the Son and the action of the Spirit. And that can help people overcome the obstacles. Because there has to be a kind of metanoia in the sense that they see things in a new way, which is what occurred to Abraham. There is no need to think that those 3 days, as he's going towards the mountain, that he understands what's going on. He's obeying, but those could be days of agony. And then the revelation that allows Jesus to say that Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. And the letter to the Hebrews is amazing the way it presents the patriarchs as having seen, and it says they saluted their Savior from afar. And if that's true for the patriarchs, in some ways, our contemporaries come to have the scales fall for their eyes gradually. And our prayer for them. We're called to pray for our contemporaries so that obstacles to their coming to believe can be overcome.
So that's a wonderful meditation on the story of Abraham and Isaac. And I'm reminded that in the Chronicles of the kings of after the First and Second Kings, you have First and Second Chronicles, that it's identified that on the mountain where Mount Moriah, where Abraham was willing to offer Isaac, is where Jerusalem is, in the mountains where Jerusalem is.
Yes.
And of course, it's in the mountains where Jerusalem is where there's, Calvary.
Yes.
And so it is actually kind of like written in stone. This typology is not only written in Scripture, but it's written in stone. And it's kind of fascinating there because in some ways, right, this ancient question that, like about why suffering or how do we endure suffering? Is it all in vain? Is it all tragic? In almost like the Greek tragedies, these sorts of elements is all real. Like we really, I think, Jordan Peterson says this about the Pietà, David's sculpture in marble of Mary holding Jesus, and this is beautiful image, but it's also Mary's larger than Jesus, so that it's kind of all strange, but Jesus is fully grown, but one of the things he mentions there is that every woman, that is Mary holding her son. And it's also every woman holding their son, because every woman who holds a son who will die, or a daughter who will die. And so to be a mother in this world is to say, I am willing to hold my child who is mortal. And so,
Joseph Pieper is very good on this. I think one of his greatest books is
The Death and Immortality?
De Liebe. His book. It's been translated two different ways. The Franciscans translated it and published it as with the title About Love, Franciscan Herald Press, and then the wonderful Joe Fessio got the rights for it and then published it along with two other works on a book now called Faith, Hope, and Love. But the book on love is his great masterpiece. It took him years to write, and there is something in the power of love that is profoundly, of human love, that is profoundly offended by the reality of death. Because when, as one of the authors that Pieper quotes says, to love someone in a certain sense is to say, thou shalt not die. So that when a loved one, because to love another is to affirm the existence of the other. As again, Pieper drawing on Aquinas on this, the very first thing that the lover does is to affirm and celebrate the existence of the beloved. It's good that you exist. It's good that you're in this world. And so when sickness, suffering, and death encounters the loved one, there is a crisis. It's something that's like a disturbance in the force. Something has happened that down deep we feel should not happen. And you go through that crisis well or poorly, and it's not to be downplayed. It's a real agony. And so you either encounter, another good example is Rabbi Israel Zoli. So Zoli was being trained to be a rabbi in a northern Italian family, and the father died, and the family was thrown into poverty. And the crushing turmoil, upside down situation in the family, he would go out into the forest in sorrow. This is in the 1920s. And he discovered that he wasn't alone, that someone was weeping with him. Someone was sharing his suffering. And he came to the conclusion, as he eventually was, the family was able to pull together and he was able to continue his rabbinic studies, that the presence of the one with whom he was weeping was the suffering servant of Isaiah. And then a few years later, when he's at university and he goes home for lunch with one of his non-Jewish friends and he sees for the first time a crucifix, he knew interiorly that the one who had been suffering with him was represented on that cross, which of course caused a great crisis. It took him, I think, 20 years for him to draw the conclusion of what that insight meant. And so then, he was baptized and took the name in honor of Pius XII. He took the name of Eugenio Eugene Zoli. But he had become the chief rabbi of Rome. And he's not unique in that journey. Most people who have that journey you never hear about. But that the mystery of suffering is confronted by the discovery that they're not suffering alone, that there's someone suffering with them, and that their suffering, they're going to lead from the suffering to new life. And that's the hardest thing, to really trust. Yeah. But here again, you get back to the idea that Aquinas says, those who are going to grow on the way have to trust the Lord like an apprentice trusts the master craftsman of the trade that they're trying to learn. And I think it's important to recognize that it's impossible on our own. This is not, the initiative is with the Lord. Grace empowers us to do things we couldn't do on our own. So if we make an act of faith, any movement towards the Lord, the initiative is with the Lord in the first place.
We're going to take a break, and when we get back, I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own journey of faith, and then we're going to look a little bit at what Aquinas has to say about this beautiful line from John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and can we believe in that today? So we'll be back in a minute.
All right, thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Love just to, for members of our, listening and viewing audience who may not know you or your work or your story, could you tell us a little bit about what's your own journey of faith? How did you, I don't know, how did you grow up? How did you end up becoming a Dominican and a theologian?
Well, God's grace is the first answer. So I grew up in a practicing Catholic family. My mother Irish and a little bit of Scottish roots. She comes from a what they call a 49er family. That is, they came with the gold rush. Her branch, so there was three adventurous Irish sorts who had spent a generation in Glasgow, Scotland, and become machinists. And they go out to San Francisco, and they brought their sister's family eventually with them. So my mom descends from that. And so that kind of, the roots are deeply in the experience of the city of San Francisco and its trials and tribulations, earthquakes, fires, all of that. So all of that on my mother's side. And then my father comes from old Puritan stock in Ipswich, Massachusetts, that did the American thing of slowly going west and becoming what I described a form of prairie Protestant, where you go to the church at baptisms, at weddings and funerals, and maybe on an occasional Sunday if the preacher is supposed to be interesting or if there's going to be good music. But in terms of, it was generic. You'd go to whatever Protestant church was closest or nearest or had the some feature. All you knew is that you weren't Catholic. So Puritanism kind of becomes forms of congregationalism. And whenever the Sherwins took their faith seriously, they became some form of Presbyterian. And for generations, there was always one who was a Presbyterian minister. My father, her first cousin, that was that. And I have I think now, what would it be? A first cousin twice removed, who's also a Presbyterian minister. I think my generation of the Sherwins will be the last to have a Presbyterian, but who knows? But Grandpa was widowed, and he then met a spunky Irish widow, and my father and aunt came from that union, and they were raised Catholics. So that's my background. It makes me a kind of interesting mixture of Protestant American independent farmers, Protestant farmers, and then these urban Irish Catholics in San Francisco. And so I'm from the union of that, which the University of California made possible. My parents were students at Berkeley. And let's see, born in the city like my mother, but raised just north of the city in Marin County, marvelous Marin. So raised in an intellectually alive, believing family. I think that's important, that it helped me navigate difficulties. And I always felt, I took for granted what I think Wordsworth says, that God was all about us in our childhoods. And I think that was my experience in childhood. And the other feature is I received what's known, the classic vocational call, something within me that was not me at a very early age, I'd say maybe 6, was saying someday you'll want to look into the priesthood. And I thought, that's just like that secret between me and this inner prompting. I didn't change my life. I didn't become an altar boy. I didn't go to a Catholic school. I continued to go to public school and only go to church on Sundays and things. But then I hit puberty, and I thought it was the worst idea in the world, and I was going to find a good Catholic girl and have a family and get married. A few things happened my last year in high school that kind of brought this into a crisis. And the crisis only subsided when I said, I'll stop saying no and I'll look into it. And if I find I can be happy doing this, then I'll pursue it. And once I said that I was open to looking into it, the kind of angst that I had been experiencing went away. So then I went to Berkeley and I shifted away from the kind of the business side of things that I was kind of being formed for. And I started studying history and philosophy, comparative religion, taking a lot of Spanish. But I was very fortunate. There was a wonderful scholar in comparative religion by the name of Mark Juergensmeyer. And his year-long interdisciplinary course had 5 field trips. We were in the quarter system in those days, which was perfect for me because I was wanting to test many different things. Berkeley's now back on the semester system. So one of the quarters had these 5 field trips to different places: the Sikh ashram, the Hillel Center, which is like a Jewish Newman Center, the Buddhist temple, the Hare Krishna Center, and St. Albert's Priory. So I like to tease people and say, instead of becoming a Hare Krishna, I became a Dominican. But when I got to, they had a wonderful tour, and I started to read up on Dominic. And I'd been raised, as a San Franciscan, I'd been raised with great devotion to St. Francis. I love St. Francis, and I love the Franciscans, but I did not feel at all called to the Franciscans. And then my mom, as a philosopher of education, had done her studies that overlapped with Jesuits in Maryknoll who were also interested in the same topics. So I'd grown up around Jesuits. My grandfather had gone through Jesuit education all the way until he went to med school. So there was that in the background. The Jesuits were a powerhouse in San Francisco. But I didn't feel called at all to be a Jesuit. I admired them, but I didn't feel called at all. But when I set foot in St. Albert's Priory and learned more about Dominic, doctrinal preaching, focusing on the Trinity, the Incarnation, the goodness of the sacraments, and then sharing that with others, that intrigued me. And then when I saw the life of the Priory, at that time, again, I was spoiled because a doctoral student, a brilliant doctoral student from Berkeley, had renounced the world and entered the order. And then, of course, first thing the order said is continue your doctoral studies. And that was Craig Thompson, who went on to become Augustine Thompson, who was studying with Robert Brentano, the Italian city-states. And, of course, the second reader was Peter Brown. Berkeley in the early 80s was a remarkable place, especially you still had a lot of these refugees from the Second World War who were alive and well and very present at Berkeley. And they were not anti-Catholic, and they were not against presenting the history of Europe from a Catholic-friendly perspective. And Peter Brown was, by using the insights of structuralist anthropologies like Mary Douglas and Edward Evans Pritchard, was revolutionizing the study of the Fathers in this kind of sociological school. But it made the Fathers accessible to people like me in ways that it would not have been accessible otherwise. And the undergraduate program in history, I think, at that time was absolutely extraordinary. And this is before internet and all these things. And these were professors who went to Europe, took slides of everything, and then their lectures, which were jam-packed, 250 people there, and they would then have the slides from, like I took Renaissance and Reformation with another. I took just all the different classes. It was visual. The whole personality was drawn into it. Now, it was kind of challenging. It raised a lot of questions about the faith. But then I could go every Friday. I'd go to Mass at St. Albert's Priory, and they invited me to come to dinner. And then I could talk to someone. I mean, I learned more at table with Augustine Thompson when he was a friar in formation and a doctoral student with Robert Brentano and Peter Brown than I had learned in whole semesters at Berkeley. So that environment, and what was so neat about it at that time is that you could ask any question. I mean, there are very few places in the world today when you can ask a question and not immediately get shot down for asking it. And that they had in the solidity of their faith and in the excellence of their formation, they could be at ease considering whatever crazy question this kid from Marin County was asking them, that impressed me. And I said, I could be happy spending my life pursuing these questions. And I also knew, and the Lord was very kind to me, I had experiences where I could see what married life would be like and how I would love that, and it would be in many ways very fulfilling. But I would still have these questions that were so vital to me that there would be a tension. I wouldn't be able to be a good father and a good husband if these other things were so overwhelmingly vital to me. I would be neglecting my primary sacramental obligations. And so one or the other had to be sacrificed. And so I realized now that the Lord was calling me to something. He knew me better than me, that he was calling me to something that would be towards my fulfillment and joy. And so, of course, all of these things have to be confirmed. After 2 years at Berkeley, in those days, we had a bachelor's program. So like Jack London, I dropped out of the University of California. I didn't go on to become an oyster pirate or a sealer, but I did drop out and finish my studies at our school and never looked back.
That's really beautiful, and it is a great kind of an incarnate story in your own life about this sense that, right, it is a grace. God acts first, and we respond, as it says in John, right, you did not choose me, but I have chosen you.
Yes, that was very much the case.
And we kind of rest in that. And I love that image, too, of the Dominican solidity and veritas, truth, which therefore can kind of calmly receive any question. And I think that's a real gift of the teacher and this preacher that is really, in a way, really, I think kind of almost begins to answer that question about the crisis of belief in our age. And I remember reading, anyway, it was a book. It was a book on something about kind of like kids who have left the faith or something like that. But one of the things that it talked about, I think it might have been called Return, written by Brandon Vaught with Word on Fire Press. But what he said was something like, the difficulty sometimes is that young people in Catholic families begin to have questions. The questions are questioning what they know is most important to their parents. So sometimes they either are embarrassed or ashamed of their questions, so they don't ask them. Or if they do, the parents themselves don't quite know how to answer them, so they can kind of be like emotionally reactive to, big questions about, about like sexuality or the church's teaching, or big questions about, communism or Marxism or something. And so you can kind of learn that in a way the questions aren't, and they kind of become embarrassed or ashamed of those questions. So then they don't ask them or get real answers to them. Yeah. And then you create a little bit of this, it inhibits the person from really making the faith their own. So I love this theme of that, to a certain extent, right, the natural light of the intellect and even the light of grace. I know Father Matthew Lamb, who was one of my colleagues and teachers here, would always say that the light of the intellect is really children asking why. It's asking those questions and trusting that the faith has within it somewhere. I may not have all the answers, but Christ has all the answers within him.
I have to, I don't want to downplay the dark nights of especially my freshman year at Berkeley. But I had things that aided me. Also, the other aspect is I had unique parents, and I was the youngest child. I was a mistake, an accident, a surprise. And I had World War II parents who lived through the Depression, especially my father, and then now, I should say, they lived through the Depression as people who were watching it occur because my grandfather was at that time a banker. So he made sure that he took his son out to visit these farms where the banks were desperately trying to get the farmers to stay on the farms and to make something work, because owning all these farms wasn't doing the banks any good. And they, to see boys his same age looking, scared behind the window, is this the sheriff to evict us? to convince farmers to stay on the farm and to try to find a way to, as a community, collectively to get out of this terrible situation. And then some would just abandon the farm, left. So they'd come there and there's no one on the farm. So my father grew up experiencing vicariously in some sense, but not having to suffer through it. I don't want to have this as an Alger his story for my father. He was comfortable in those years, and my mother was the daughter of a doctor, so they didn't suffer the harshness of the depression, but they saw it and they lived through it. And then the war. But by the time I came along, they were old hands at this. They had raised 2 older sons, and in many ways, I think I benefited from what they had learned raising their older kids. Yeah. And my mom was a philosopher of education, and I really benefited from all of that. The other was they read everything. And the library, discovering, for example, We Have Been Friends Together by Raïs Amaritain, and the sequel, Adventures in Grace, which are now often published together as We Have Been Friends Together, their own journey. And then The Story of the Soul and The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. All these books that I discovered in my father and mother's library helped me through difficult days of my freshman year. And so, and again, MacIntyre is very good about this, that the examples of others are also there to help you understand the narrative of your own life. What Jacques and Raïs experienced at the Sorbonne at the beginning of the 20th century in many ways reflected my experience of about 2/3 of my classes at Berkeley. And I'll never forget how she describes our professors had despaired of truth, whose word, the very word, was unlovely to them and can only be spoken through the quotation marks of a disillusioned smile. And if you're the student who have such professors as that, finding your way through it is difficult. And Grace reached out to them and changed their lives. And of course, she wrote that book as an exile to help the next generation. Yeah. And then Therese, I think, is incredible the way in which she reaches out to help certain people who need her help. And that book was amazing. Yeah. I mean, I'm not into all that flowery language, but you can break through it to see the core insights that she's conveying. Yeah.
We are beginning to get kind of close to the end of our podcast time, but could you kind of just in a short version, you gave a whole lecture on this, so I know it's going to be hard, but just in a few minutes, could you kind of summarize how does Aquinas help us to interpret, right, what Jesus means when he says, right, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's the summation of everything in the Old Testament. And the Fathers and the New Testament authors are absolutely clear that every time the angel of the Lord appears to a patriarch, you can see this in iconography, the old Byzantine iconography. It's Christ. It's what the Easterners call the pre-incarnate Christ. So they often portray it as the face of Jesus with the unique Christological halo, but then they'll give him wings to show that this is before the Incarnation. So the angel of the Lord is the Word. It's the Father appearing to the patriarch through the Son in the fire of the Spirit. So you've got the full Trinity there, but the encounter is coming through the one who is announcing. The angel of the Lord is the eternal Word speaking to his creature, whether it's on Sinai or wherever. And what is the primary moral idea? It's this right relationship with God, to be Zedekah. And when Abraham receives the commission to pass on the teaching of Zedekah, it is described as following the ways of the Lord. So the primary understanding of the Old Testament morality is to the tribes of Israel to learn to live right relationship with God by walking in his ways. And as Paul will say, the law was there. The law comes after the patriarch's experience. It's there to point to fulfillment, to prefigure fulfillment, and to show both what the way is and reveal the people's insufficiency to walk the way on their own. So the law is it's leading people. It's a pedagogue. It leads the people of Israel to realize their need for grace and what grace would entail, that every moment of their life is lived in right relationship with the Lord. Well, the only one who's able to do that is the incarnate Christ. And so Paul will say, Jesus is our tzedekah. Jesus is our dikaiosune. Jesus is our justice. He fulfills the law by living it completely. Perfect right relationship in his humanity. The divinity and the humanity united in the person of the eternal Word. And therefore, Paul will then go on to say, in Jesus, we become the justice of God. So that by being incorporated through the baptism into the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, we finally can fulfill what the whole goal of all of this was. So Jesus, therefore, is another way of saying that Jesus is justice, is Jesus is the way. He fulfills the whole purpose of the Old Testament revelation. Everything points to him, and everything finds fulfillment in him. And of course, if we're made in the image of Christ, he's the beginning. He's the Alpha and the Omega. That's how the New Testament ends, right? He's the Alpha. He's the beginning. We're made in his image, and that image is perfected in us by walking in his ways. But of course, he is the way. You know the way, walk in it. And then the truth and the life, he is truth itself. He is life itself. And so we become true and truly alive in the fullness of time, in the loving vision of God in heaven, in the celestial banquet, in the city of God, all these communal ways of being united to the triune God. So he is the concrete historical way in which the Lord chose to not only reveal the Father's love and be the means of the Spirit being able to act upon us interiorly, but it corresponds to our human needs, to have a human contact with the divine in the humanity of Christ. But from the humanity we become by adoption what the Lord is by nature. We become adopted sons and daughters of God. And so it's a beautiful vocation, and that's what it means for Jesus to be the way. Now that's all the good Johannine and Pauline theology together, but what that means in the concrete, you only can say by living a life.
Yeah. And of course, as you have mentioned and as Aquinas speaks about, right, it is Christ as man who is our way back to God. Yes. And so, right, so for Thomas, right, he sees, right, Christ at the center, right, as he puts it one time in the Gospel of John, right, in itself, God is the center of all reality and learning. But for us, we have to get to God through Jesus. So Christ becomes Christ and his teaching and his way. He's the way to his humanity, becomes the way to his divinity. And we can kind of climb up the Incarnation to get home to God.
And to be given something that is not naturally not at all possible.
Yes.
To participate within the triune life of God. Mm-hmm. And that's the great mystery. Yeah. I mean, God reveals himself as a Trinity only in the act of saving us from sin and death. Yeah. It's through the salvific act that we discover that intimacy of the Lord that we can't understand. God is perfectly one and perfectly three, and we are called to participate in that ministry or that mystery through the mission of the Lord.
Yeah, we learn that God's not metaphorically a father,
no,
but that he is a father, and that we're not metaphorically his children, but that we become his children in grace in Jesus Christ. So as we're getting close to the end of our time, I have 3 questions I like to ask all my guests. What's a book you're reading?
Oh, let's see. I'm always reading about 10 books. What is the book that I'm having the most fun reading at the moment? I should have thought of that. I'm a big fan of military history because I think you learn a lot about character. And there is a book by Susan Eisenhower on how Ike led. And I very much enjoyed reading that. I finished that. But in terms of what I'm reading right now that's got my attention, I'm rereading A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a guilty pleasure. And I'm also rereading the essays of Walker Percy. For example, I read his review of Canticle Leibowitz. He was one of the great reviewers. His review of Confederacy of Dunces is a masterpiece. And his review of Canticle for Leibowitz is also good.
Well, that'd be fun to do a whole podcast on that. And that book's right at the heart of MacIntyre's After Virtue in different ways. So there's so much about it that's rich. I know you have many, but what's maybe one spiritual practice that helps you, go along the way that is Christ that you would want to speak about?
Well, one that's neglected, and I because I don't consider myself, I think this idea that I was appointed to the Spirituality Institute is a proof that God has a sense of humor. So I don't consider myself at all an expert on these things, but something that helped me tremendously that I learned from Dorothy Day reading her Long Loneliness is Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. So Brother Lawrence was an illiterate cook at the Carmelite monastery in the heart of Paris, which is where the Institut Catholique is, right? That's where that monastery was. Anyway, the friars began to write down his sayings, and it became the book called The Practice of the Presence of God. And oftentimes God will inspire us to think of him. And our reaction in our silliness is to beat ourselves up that we don't have time for the perfect prayer. And what Brother Lawrence said, no, if God comes to mind, just use it as a way to express your love for him, or as that moment in a busy day to express your love for him, or to share some concern you have. Because people, we bump into things all day long that, that person needs a prayer, or it just is heavy on our heart. The practice of the presence of God is the discipline analogous to the discipline that married couples have to pay attention to each other and to convey their love for each other in all the different activities of the day. That's what Brother Lawrence is recommending, that if we're going to have these other great spiritual practices, Lectio Divina or the office, something that will make it easier for us to do is simply have that moment-by-moment colloquy. Not some added burden, but whenever God comes to mind, instead of beating ourselves up about not being a perfect person in prayer, just say to him, I love you, Lord, I love you, or pray for this person, or help me to this. The other is the morning offering, in a way that there's always something that I'm worried about. And if I just simply say to the Lord, Lord, I give you this meeting with this person. I give you this thing that I'm worrying about. And if we get in the habit of just doing that offering, that I give the whole situation, I end up discovering the whole thing worked out in ways that I never would have imagined. So I recommend the renewing of that kind of morning offering, in the sense that whatever it is I'm worrying about that I have to confront that day, I give it to the Lord. And then getting into the habit of simply, whenever the Lord comes to mind, saying something that expresses either my need for forgiveness, or my concern for someone else, or my simple love for him, keeps the colloquy going.
Yeah. And what's a belief you held about God that you discovered was false, and what was the truth you discovered?
I think this is kind of common. I had a kind of good Puritan idea that the Lord was, as a good middle class, that he's worried about success in ways that I don't think the Lord is worried. And the Lord is hunting. When you're all powerful, you realize he doesn't need my help. So the canons of success, which have been the bourgeois versions of Christianity are very often attribute this to God in ways that are not helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think living in Latin cultures were the first steps towards breaking that down. That there are more important things than being than living according to certain canons of what is efficacious or efficient.
Yeah.
God is not concerned with efficiency.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Well, Father Michael Sherwin, who is the professor of fundamental moral theology at the Angelicum, director of the Institute of Spirituality. And if people are interested, where can they find you?
My my email address is easy to find at the Angelicum. There's two different things. There's just the simple teaching in the STL program of fundamental moral theology. And then there's the diploma program, which is really the Institute for Spirituality was founded mainly, besides promoting the kind of activities that we've been doing here. It's to a year-long program in spirituality that is a non-academic program.
Okay.
Where people can experience Rome as kind of like if Aquinas had written the fourth part of the Summa, it would probably be ecclesiology. Well, Rome, in a certain sense, is a visual ecclesiology that's expressed in all the different buildings and all the different sanctuaries. And so that's part of the program. And then also studying the tradition of the great teachings of spiritual writers. And then getting a kind of foundation in healthy moral theology, because of the great tradition of Father Garrigou Lagrange, who didn't found the Institute. A lot of people think that he founded it. It was actually the Cardinal Paul Philippe, no relation to the Philippe brothers. Yeah. He founded it to kind of respond to the perceived need in 1950 to form something that was foreign to our tradition, spiritual directors. Mm-hmm. And but now it's much more evolved into a place. A lot of people find themselves in transition, whether they are students who want to do a gap year, we have a few of those, or whether it's someone who's been in one job for a long time is shifting to another job. The year in Rome to really study the great traditions of the Church in terms of whether it's Benedict, Catherine of Siena, Thomas Aquinas, the Carmelites, the Desert Fathers. They like that. That year with us is helpful to them. So that's another great thing if people want to come to Rome for that. But I've got my email there, easy to find.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Father, for being on the show. It's been great to have you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.